So I wonder whether any of you have seen the paintings by Thomas Jones. He's a Welsh painter who spent 7 years in Naples and, 7 years in Italy, 3 years in Naples. And this is probably his most famous painting. It's in the National Gallery. Thomas Jones has had a kind of hard time. He certainly had a hard time when he was a painter. He didn't make any money as a landscape painter in Italy. In fact, left Naples and went back to England and then to Wales when things didn't work out. And his real, the time in which he really enjoyed fame was long after he was dead in the 1950s. So there was a kind of revival in his interest, partly because of the almost hyper-realism of these paintings and their abstraction, I suspect. So it's sort of the 1950s that he's revived as a painter. So this is the one painting that he's best known for. And this is other paintings. This one in particular is a painting of rooftops. So his image of the city was not very peopled, quite abstract. And these are the kind of paintings that have sort of gained attention. So he's, as I say, it was really in the 1950s that he became better known. There's a picture of Thomas Jones. He was Welsh, those are his dates, 1743 to 1803. He spent, 6 years in Italy, and 3 of those in Rome and 3 of them in Naples. As you can see, he was a resident in Rome for those 3 years, and he had 2 daughters, one who was born in Rome and the other one who was born in Naples. He was living with a Danish woman called Maria Monca, who he met, who was his housekeeper in Rome, and he later married her in London. And there was, out of that interest in the 1950s, the publication of his memoirs, which remain in Wales, and they were published in 1951. And the focus of my talk today is his Italian, what's called his Italian accounts book. That's how it's named. And it is in Wales in Powys County Council archive. And there's another picture of him with his family on his return. Okay, so Thomas Jones is unusual in a lot of different ways. As I said, he tried to make a living as a landscape painter, and he did that oil on canvas, and there are many of those paintings left. But he clearly spent a lot of time painting images like this, and they're on paper, so they weren't meant to be sold. They're very personal in lots of ways, and interestingly, they only really come onto the market in the 20th century, right? And they're sort of, as I say, kind of revived in the 20th century. Here's another one. They're extraordinarily kind of beautiful, very evocative of the urban city. And I say evocative because his memoirs are also evocative as well. He's got a real sensibility about smells and time and space. And I think that's, obvious in these paintings. In the 18th century, he was actually known for these very detailed paintings. Contemporaries commented on the fact that they were extraordinarily detailed. And evocative. And I think that's actually something that I want to return back to when I look at the account books. So we've got the one set of memoirs and these paintings as kind of, if you want, remnant, vestige of his time, of his time in Naples. Most painters to Naples were interested in people. They weren't interested so much in the buildings. I've got a painting here by Antonio Jolly. And this kind of detail that you can see here on this street life is the thing that really painters were interested, in painting and also engraving. And this is a book of customs and costumes, if you want, by Peter Fabris, who might have been British or maybe Anglo-Italian, who was a kind of collaborator with William Hamilton. So these are the kinds of images coming out of Naples in the 1770s and 1780s. So if you just go back to the Jolly painting as well. So Thomas Jones paintings are really unusual, completely without people. There are no people in any of those, in any of the paintings. And this is the accounts book. It's beautiful in many ways. This is bought in turn at the very beginning of his grand tour, but actually not used until he got to Naples. There are a few sketches on his way down, in a few sketches near Florence, a couple of things related to Rome, but primarily he's using it for his time in Naples. There are some things at the very end of the book which are related to his time in England and also to Wales, but it's essentially a Neapolitan book. I think of the, let me just see, of the 3/4 of the book, so 59 of the 80 folio pages are taken up by these accounts. So there's some Neapolitan stuff on top of that, but it's about 3/4 of the accounts book is Neapolitan. And that's what they look like. I thought I should just give you a sense of what they look like. Now, I'm just going to go forward for 1 second just to show you, just to show you the beginning of the accounts. They're in English. I'll go back in a second. But this is literally the day in which he arrives in Naples, and the cost that the cost of paying off the customs, the porters, and then he starts setting up his household on the 26th of May. I'll return back to this, and then later on I'll show you that, what happens with some of the with language. So that's a kind of typical page. This is what most of the folios look like. So they're dated. It's got the day of the week, and also he includes everything he buys. Now, occasionally he'll say altre spese, so other expenses. So there is a little bit of room for speculation, but more or less he writes down everything. And as you can see here in Italian, he's paying a monthly fee to a barber. His household pays a monthly fee to a wet nurse, so you can track his children's ages really by the 2 wet nurses that he's paying, then reduces it down to 1. So there's a presence of his children. Laundry, melon, a letter that he sends, things to do with transportation. I'll return to these things in a second. And if you can see at the very last part of the list here, that he's moving between Italian and English still, but he then almost entirely goes into Italian. So this is the kinds of information the accounts books provide. So he's setting up his house. You can see him buying kitchen equipment, even used items as well. Clothing, lots of clothing to mend, clothes, shoe repairs, hems, a whole range of kinds of sewing going on in the household. There is a very strong presence of the service industry in these accounts. A lot of movement as he moves around the city to see clients, to go to different studios as well. Hairdresser, servants, carpenter. As I say, he's moving around the city, but also going outside of the city as well. Lots of trips with his wife or with friends, fellow painters, for instance, who are going to Sorrento, for instance, or to Capri. Entertainment, lots of entertainment, going to the theater, buying lottery tickets, playing games, different kinds of games. And these little luxuries, tobacco, sort of things for his face or his wife's face, kind of things, pharmaceutical products as well. A few books, most of them titled. So he usually gives a title for the books. He doesn't say libro. He usually explains what they are. Lots of guidebooks, very interestingly. And the thing that he's actually, what it's being used most for, first of all, I should say that it hasn't been published and it's hardly being used. And when it has been used, it's being used by art historians trying to track, what kind of colors he's buying, for instance. There's a lot of, because he gives so much detail, the kind of colors he's buying. One of the things I'm interested in is the way he switches languages. He starts in English, he moves to Italian, and occasionally you can hear the Neapolitan in the way in which he writes out a word. Yeah, interestingly. So it's not that he's writing in Neapolitan, but he's mishearing sometimes things, and it's a Neapolitan word. And I don't know whether he knows whether it's Italian or Neapolitan. And he sometimes puts in his own translations. So for instance, there's what he calls cucumbers, cidiriola, and he puts those in brackets. So he sometimes provides translations within the text itself. And a really helpful table on prices and weights, and also currency as well. Currency in Rome, currency in Naples. And also very interesting, the measures used for different kinds of foodstuffs, right? He has that in one page at the very beginning of the book. Now, when I think I first spoke to people organizing the seminar, I was going to talk about the database. And the database has been constructed, it continues to be constructed. And this is a piece that's come out of it. I haven't really done quantifying work yet. That's really not my thing. I still have to learn how to use the database. But these are some of the things that I was interested in, and I hope to be able to kind of discover as I go along. One is the kinds of buying he's doing over a week, over a year, over seasons as well. So this question of seasonality. If I were more of an economic historian, I probably could track, for instance, prices of food. For instance, the price of coffee stays more or less the same throughout the 3 years. So you could certainly do that. And also things like, the prices of also fuel, coal, wood, that kind of thing as well, because he's buying that almost every week. Consumer choices. He's buying used objects quite often. Cooking utensils. He's replacing quite often pots, which is the kind of thing that now, as material culture historians of food, we're very interested in, is this question about, broken ceramics, repairs, that kind of thing. You can see him replacing things. I'm quite interested in the ratio of different kinds of food, the relationship between meat, fish, fowl, dairy. And something that I know that Charlie's also interested in is this link to food hawking licenses, to the seasons of this food hawking and also food prohibitions. And finally, in a more autobiographical way, how this database would link to his professional life in terms of the kinds of dinners, when he's going out for dinner or his outings. You can match up rather neatly a lot of the account books with what he describes as a night out, for instance. So it's quite a kind of easy way to do a kind of potted autobiography. There's occasional signs of his wife. So she says to Marie, I'm ready, I am sometimes. So his wife's presence is not really very strong. She's much clearer in the memoirs. She's not so clear here. And it's something I've been thinking about, whether she's doing the buying or whether he's in fact doing the buying. I suspect he might be doing the buying. It's not clear whether he has servants doing the buying. There might be layers to the street. I'm not so sure, and I can talk about that as well, whether he's actually doing the buying on the street. Okay, so when I first looked at the account book and I knew the memoirs were there, I thought, this is great. I mean, this is a kind of autobiography. And there has been some recent work by a man called Adam Smythe about account books as ego documents, as autobiographies, that they have a kind of rhetoric, right? There are things that are omitted. It's not, it's kind of beguiling as a representation of a reality. But in fact, he argues that accounts leave things out, right? And are structured by, forces beyond, they're not. It's not simply just about, as it happened. I mean, he might be adding things late at night, for instance. It's not necessarily. It's quite tempting, for instance, to look at these lists and assume that they're done in, that they follow kind of day to night. That as he buys things, he writes things down. I think sometimes actually that is the case, but I can give you some examples where I'm not entirely sure. But as you can see here, you can see him setting up a household. It's like perfect in many ways. You can see someone setting up a household, buying a tinderbox, chairs, tableware. And as I say, it's extremely beguiling. And here's some more, just to give you a kind of closer look at some of these things. So you can see him buying fuel. And you can see when he says, lay for the first night in my new lodging. So he even uses the word my rather than our. It's very interesting because we know that Maria is there and that his one daughter is there as well. But you get a kind of sense of someone setting up a life. One of the things I'm interested in relation to the database, which I might say just now, is that I'm quite interested in what he buys together. And that's because I'm interested in food hawking, and I'm interested in what a food hawker might be selling at the same time. So he groups often products together. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with the database, is trying to link up whether there's a kind of pattern in the kinds of things he's buying. That is presuming that when he writes all that down under one sum, that he's bought it all from the same place. One of the things I think that is unusual is that it seems to me that he's paying out money for this. He's not buying things for credit. He's not buying things for credit, which I think would be more likely the case if you were in a kind of London context in one period. I don't know whether Matt knows more about, but that's my understanding, or Charlie. that it's unusual that he's literally, paying for these things. He's not going to shop. So I don't know whether that means that he's then, buying things from the street in all cases. I don't think so. But there's no distinction here between buying from the street or buying from the shop. And it's something that I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say. Okay, so that is a rather fuzzy picture of the drawing that he provides in his memoirs. And it's his first apartment. So I should say as well that Jones spends a little bit more than a year in this apartment. I won't talk about the other two apartments, but this is the one that I'm most interested in. He says in his memoirs that he's actually painting this kitchen. He has a moment in his memoirs where he says, "I'm painting the kitchen." He's doing a still life in his kitchen, but unfortunately it doesn't survive. So I have no image of the kitchen itself, but I do have an image of where the kitchen sits. From how he describes it, and I'll talk to you about it in a second, that it's likely that the showroom and the study are looking out onto the street, and that the kitchen, the eating room, the bedchamber are looking back onto a warehouse. This is a image of Naples a little bit later from where he was. I think it's important to remind you that Naples, along with London, is one of the 3 largest cities of Europe in this period. So there's more than 400,000 people. It's a big city. And Thomas Jones lives near the port. He lives in front of the Dogana di Sale, which is the salt custom house. And in fact, that image I showed you at the very beginning is in fact an image of the Dogana di Sale. And he lives just behind here. And so he's quite close to the sea, and he's really at the center, the commercial center of Naples as well. And he describes the noise, he describes the kids hanging around in the streets, he describes people, pushing barrows by. As I say, he's quite sensitive to noise, sound, light, heat. Yeah. And as I say, I think that attention to detail in the accounts is, I think, sort of representative of that desire to describe, to represent. So he lives in what's called Città Bassa, as I said. It's one of the most densely parts of Naples and one of the most densely populated cities of Europe. I think that's really important. It's very, very densely populated, as it is today, actually, as it is today. Okay, so provisioning the city. This is an image from the middle of the 17th century. It's an image of the market square, not far from where Jones lived, but I'm not entirely convinced that that's where he bought his food. I suspect he bought his food slightly closer to home. It gives you a sense of the kind of activity of the early modern market in Naples. And this is a description of Naples by Lorenzo Giustiniani, in which he's really celebrating the size of Naples. So the size of Naples and its populousness is a kind of trope in early modern travel literature. So that's one of the things that travelers to Naples always want to see. They see lots of people and they expect to see lots of people. So it's a highly densely populated place, but people even from London and Paris, first thing they kind of remark upon is this populousness of Naples. And in part, one of the extensions of that trope is that they expect to see lots of people selling food on the street, lots of people on the street. And that's actually part of a kind of representational tradition. So the populousness of the city, but also the activity on the street. And here Giustiniani is saying, that there are a whole range of kinds of sellers on the street. In posti fissi are kind of fixed places, but there are also ambulant sellers as well, roaming the streets, selling a whole range of kinds of food, and that you can buy all these kinds of food for not just necessities, but a whole range of kinds of things for a range of households. And I think that's very important, that these street sellers are not selling only to the poor. They're selling to a range of kinds of households. In other work that I've done, it's clear that what's being sold on the street, a lot of it is not just, hot food to fill the belly of the poor, but sometimes ready-made food or ready-to-cook food. So things that have been husked or milled or sort of pre-prepared with equipment before they then get sold on the street. I think that's really important to recognize there's a whole range of social groups buying food on the street. Okay. And I know this because there is a remarkable collection of food licenses or licenses for food hawkers in Naples. It's highly regulated. So on the one hand, travelers are saying and remarking on the populousness. They're also remarking on the chaos of the streets. So they think of Naples as a chaotic place. And the people selling and running around, that kind of activity sort of shows that it's a chaotic place, but in fact, it's highly regulated. And so that's another thing I'd like to say that about which I've written before, which is that what some economic historians call an informal economy is far from informal. It's highly regulated. Okay. The grand tourists and travelers to Naples don't really notice it. Occasionally people figure out that something's going on, that taxes are being paid, but it's highly regulated because of this desire to kind of tax what's being sold on the streets. So on your right-hand side is actually a very typical painting. It's by Peter Fabris. It's the same man who did that book of customs before. And this is the kind of thing. It's a kind of montage of different food sellers. They're not, I don't think they would have all been in the same place, but they're types that he kind of paints over and over again. So at the very back, I don't know whether you can see, but the very back, there's a man selling ice cream. Can you see that? And those young boys in the front appear quite often in some of his paintings. They're selling cooked pears, pericotte. And then there's this watermelon seller who's been slightly cut off on the side there. And that motion that he's doing of holding the two melons, he's cutting them open, right? So you can see the freshness of the melon, is a kind of gesture that gets painted again and again and photographed in the late 19th and early 20th century in Naples. So it becomes kind of emblematic of the city, this kind of watermelon seller selling his watermelon. And the left-hand side is a license. It's not a license that was given to someone. It's a form for a license. So it's a formula written out. And as if you can see there are kind of like blanks in which you write in the person's name. I don't know yet in much detail how the licensing system worked on the ground, but I suspect that probably in shops, people had licenses displayed or they carried them around with them. Yeah. So there are lots of licenses actually that survive, and also receipts of taxes paid in the Neapolitan archives, which I should say have not been used. There's a really extraordinary kind of archival source there, uncatalogued and have not been used. And it's a kind of vestige of this concern by the city to control food in the city, on the streets, both in terms of the quality of the food, because these licenses refer to the quality of the food, but also to things like movement in the city as well, right? So they're concerned about movement around the city. Okay, and so the kinds of food that appears in Jones's account book are, I mean, this is a whole range of things. I won't go through everything, but there's cheese, there's fish, there's an extraordinary kind of range of kinds of fish names that he uses. A lot of meat, a lot of offal, quite a lot of offal. A whole range of kinds of condiments and herbs, wine, and various kinds of alcohol. A very impressive range of vegetables, and I'm going to return back to that in very soon. And some fruits, and lots of macaroni, and lots of like baked goods as well, and lots of bread. So there's a whole, you kind of the kinds of things you'd expect to be eating. As I say, I would like to do more work on like the proportion of the food that's being eaten. I don't think he's quite following, what may or may not have been Catholic practice in this period. I'm not sure that people were, in fact, not eating meat on Fridays. I've done a kind of trawl through the database to see if he's buying fish on a Thursday or buying fish on a Friday. And sometimes he is and sometimes he isn't. So it's hard to know. I mean, that's another thing about these accounts. So when you buy something are you going to eat it right away? I'll talk to you about storage in a second. So things like food acculturation, I'm quite interested in. Does he follow Lenten seasons? Does he eat fish on a Friday? He's definitely, you can see that there's a festive rhythm in the accounts as well. So for instance, Christmas, New Year, he's buys a baked turkey, gallinacho, for Christmas Eve. Clearly fits into the story about food fashion. So he's, drinking coffee, tea, sugar, very little chocolate. I'll leave the mangiafoglio, mangiamacaroni in a second. It's a kind of way of thinking about Neapolitan diets in this period, that they move from eating leaves and vegetables to macaroni, and he's definitely eating lots of macaroni. So he fits this type, this paradigm that Emilio Sereni suggested in 1958. But it's actually based on a kind of popular representation of Neapolitans, that they are mangiafoglie, they eat leaves, and then they later on they become mangiamacaroni. And there's that image over there on the right-hand side, again by Fabris, of Neapolitans eating macaroni, which it becomes also emblematic of the way in which Naples gets represented. So the watermelon setter is one, and that the macaroni eater is the other. Quite interested in food origins, where this food is coming from. He's very he's attentive and often saying where something comes from. So vitello di Sorrento, it's veal, comes from Sorrento. He knows, and he actually remarks in his memoirs, that veal from Sorrento is known to be a delicacy. So he's very clear in the accounts that he's buying specific kinds of meat. Also, cheeses from England and Holland, as well as local cheeses. And there is clearly food seasons, and I'll go to that next. So you can see the seasons. So another trope about Naples, Naples is a city that seems to encourage tropes, is that it is a place of abundance. That's there from antiquity. Okay, Campagna Felix is one of the ways to think about that, the area around Naples. And John Jackson, who was the Uncle Samuel Pepys, makes this remark. He gets stuck in Naples because there's bad weather, and he spends a far longer time there than he wants. And he writes to him in one of the letters that he wrote when he couldn't leave, the ship wasn't leaving. He remarks in March that they could find all these fruits and vegetables that they wouldn't have been able to find in Britain. So that's it. It's a trope. It's very much a trope about Naples, but you can see it in the account books as well. So you can see Jones, and I've just cut out a bit. I've got a bit of the accounts book there where he says, so it's Monday the 29th. He's buying some meat, and he says piselli per la prima volta, tre mazzi. So it's 3 bunches of peas for the first time. He very rarely buys, I think this is important, I'll return to it again. He very rarely buys dried beans, okay, and dried goods. He for broad beans, for instance, he's buying them almost always fresh. Why do we know? Because he describes them quite often as bunches rather than in weight, okay. The great consumers, I mean, I've looked at some other evidence from this period. The great consumers of like these dried goods are much larger aristocratic houses and monasteries. And I'm going to return to that in a second, because what I'd like to sort of suggest is that the food choices that Jones makes are partly determined by the space in which he's living. Okay, so he's buying a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables, right? Sorry, that's a mid-17th century drawing of some cherries, which I love, by Carlo Dolci. If you want the reference for the accession number for it, I'll give it to you. Sorry, I haven't given it there. But there, what I love about that painting is the sense of its freshness, right? Okay. So Jones buys a lot of salad, a lot of fresh salad, and a lot of vegetables. And we know that in the very late 17th century, there is a fashion for salads in Britain. It comes out of an interest in vegetarianism. If you think about Thomas Trine, for instance, which is partly related to animal rights, partly related to kind of religious ideas about whether we should be eating animals or not. But it's a fashion. It's definitely a fashion, and there's definitely an interest in the kind of seasonality of different kinds of leaves. So I've just taken a picture on the right-hand side of a list in Evelyn's book on salads, in which he describes different kinds of leaves and what you should eat, whether they can be cooked, for instance, on what their season is. So there is in the 17th century a real interest in the seasonality of these salads. And the reason why I bring this out is because I think a lot of food history is dominated by meat. So if you look at histories of early modern Europe, for instance, there is quite an emphasis on meat, and you think, well, why so much meat? And well, that's partly because we're looking at elite sources. I think that's first of all. And I also think there's a kind of performative quality to these descriptions, sometimes printed of feasts in which they tell you, 3 capons, 10 partridges, and 12 swans. So there's a kind of performative aspect to to meat. And I think that as historians of early modern food, a lot of the sources that come to us, like through guilds, for instance, are sources related to meat. So if you look at food guilds in Dutch cities, this comes from work by a colleague of mine called Danielle van den Heuvel, who edited that book on food hawkers with me, is that the guilds, the butchers' guilds, have left sources, they've left records. The women who's selling the vegetables, who are coming in from outside of the city and have maybe collected some wild leaves or something, or have grown something in their garden, are not regulated in the same way, and they haven't left sources in the same way. Yeah, so that's one way in which the sources kind of move, if you want, possibly kind of distort the story. The other way is that if you look at menus for the early modern period, for instance, in a Cambridge college, again, you can see the accounts, and the accounts are full of meat. They're like hardly any vegetables and hardly any fruit. So is it just that they're eating lots of meat? No, it's probably more likely they're not buying the fruit and vegetables. They're bringing it in either from their own estates, from actually college grounds, for instance, or they're bringing it in from their own estates. So I think there kind of might be a distortion in our in the way in which meat has such a kind of principal role in the history of food. And I'll return back to that. But there is, and I think this is a very important one, this fashion related to salads in early modern England, which is partly related to religion and to health, ideas about health. But there is, in the Catholic world, a very sophisticated cuisine, vegetarian cuisine, which is related to Lent and related to Fridays as well. So I just want to make sure that we get the vegetables back into, I'm not a vegetarian. I think that there's something missing here. And I think what's quite interesting about Jones is that he's eating meat, offal, he's eating a lot of different things, but he's eating a lot of vegetables, and he's very specific about the kinds of vegetables he buys, as I say, even using Neapolitan words. This is just an example of Pepys's obsession with lettuce seeds. So all these grand tourists in the late 17th century in particular, not so much in the 18th century, often want to bring back lettuce seeds. That's one of the things. So, Pepys is asking Jackson to bring back some lettuce seeds. I include this book here because I'm sorry I haven't given you the details. It's a book of vegetarian cooking from the late 18th century, 1781. It's dedicated to this British aristocrat in Naples. So it's exactly the time when Thomas Jones is there. Now the question is, Thomas Jones is eating so much vegetables, he's just following this kind of British fashion for vegetarianism? I don't think so. I think that the buying of the vegetables, the buying of the fruit is, as I say, partly determined by the place in which he lives.
Could I ask, would a Roman lettuce seed be any different from an English one?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Actually, I don't know much about the kind of botany around this, but there probably is a kind of culture of interest in specific kinds of but they want them brought back. I guess just like, when they're traveling around the world, they want different kinds of botanical samples. Yeah. So this is his description, his memoirs of this room. I don't know whether you're familiar, but Tara Hamlin and Catherine Richardson fairly recently have written a book about everyday England. It's a co-edited book, and they talk a lot about the back side of the house. And the backside, the kitchen is often not in inventories. We know that, and certainly not kitchenware often doesn't appear in inventories either, or if it does, it appears in one kind of big lump. So that's a problem as a food historian, to try and get closer to what's happening actually in the kitchen. And there is no backside to this house. I know from his descriptions of his Roman house that he has a separate shed where he keeps animals and where they're storing things. He mentions here or elsewhere he talks about an open staircase. He mentions elsewhere, and he actually buys equipment related for a well. So he buys some rope and he buys some buckets as well. So it's almost certainly a courtyard in the middle of this warehouse building. So the warehouse is on the bottom floor, and then the two apartments are on the top floor. So it looks like there is no back house. There's certainly limited storage in the house itself. And as you can see, probably if you brought clients in, they'd go through the antechamber, through into the showroom. They wouldn't really see the kitchen. The kitchen is quite far back into the house. Okay, so one of my first things and related to this kind of trying to kind of imagine the food choices he's making is to take a look at that kitchen. It's very unlikely that he had an open fire. So I don't think he's doing a lot of roasting. One, roasting takes a lot of energy, as we know from Craig Moultroux's sort of fuel energy from Craig Moultroux's work. And two, it's quite contained and not very well ventilated. Okay. So I think it's some kind of sort of oven that probably he can close, and there are burners on the top. And then on top of those burners, probably he's cooking with ceramic dishes. He's probably stewing things, and I'm going to go back there. So I think this is less likely a place for roasting. And as I said to you before, less likely that there's actually, you know, place to store dried beans and things like he's buying things every day. He does mention storage vessels. I've just got this one on the left-hand side because it's a pickle jar. He buys vinegar. I know that he buys vinegar, and he does buy terracotta containers. So it's possible that he's storing things and preparing things as well. It would be great. I haven't quite done it, but I have tried to see whether he's buying a lot of cucumbers, for instance, and a lot of vinegar, and then pickling them. And I've got that image on the right-hand side, which is a direct reference to the possibility that people are buying cucumbers and then taking them home and pickling themselves. These are both British examples. There are no Italian examples of this. It's possible, however, though, that he might be using the vinegar on his salad. So Evelyn in that salad book gives, I think, about 9 steps to make a salad. And I mean, as an Italian historian, I mean, I know there's salads in kind of Renaissance Italy, but it's quite extraordinary to see the detail with which Evelyn describes this sort of salad preparation. When he's in Rome, Thomas Jones makes this remark that he's just completely tired of Italian soups and stews, and he wants to live in the English style, and he wants to, you know, have roast beef and plum pudding. Well, that might have been the case in Rome, and it might have been possible, but it doesn't look like it was the case in Naples because of the size of that kitchen. So here is something. So these are some of the things that are in the back of the account books. And so on the left-hand side, or this left-hand side here is to stew a beef steak. And then there's this on the right-hand side, another recipe about using mutton. He buys a lot of mutton as well, a lot of offal. I mean, that's just for the first 6 months of the offal that he's buying. So he's buying liver and feet and hearts and heads, and that's all in contemporary cookbooks. What's interestingly not in contemporary cookbooks from Naples, macaroni. So the pasta doesn't appear in the cookbooks. So there's a kind of disjuncture between what he's buying, but all these other things definitely. Songbirds, for instance, they're all there, and he's buying songbirds. He's buying a variety of kinds of meat and fowl. So just if you look at the recipe on the right-hand side, which is in the same hand as the accounts, he talks about needing a slow fire. Right, a slow fire for these things. He repeats that again and again. At the very top here, he talks about a tegame, which is a kind of earthenware pot, and he's buying them. He's buying them in the account books. I think he's buying a lot of offal because it's not roastable in the same way. I think it's stewing. I think he's stewing a lot of things, and so that's what I'm trying to suggest, that in that small kitchen, there isn't the space, as it would be in a much larger house, to roast things. But actually, he's doing a lot of stewing on those 2 burners he's got in the kitchen.
When you said there's no macaroni recipes, do you mean in Italian books? Or? In
the Italian books, so contemporary Neapolitan books. There's in the Neapolitan book that's published in this period. It's like the bestseller of Naples. It's by the same man as the a vegetarian book. His name is Vincenzo Corrado, and it's called Cuoco Galante, the Gallant Cook, and it is the bestseller of all books in Naples in the 1780s, and there's no mention of macaroni there. So there's an idea of macaroni as a kind of plebeian food.
Because there are pasta recipes in English books earlier than that.
Yeah. But he's definitely eating a lot of macaroni. Okay, how are we doing for time, Matt?
It's 6:15.
Okay.
So right, actually, yeah.
10 minutes.
Okay, fine. I think I'll be finished before then. Okay. And so that has led me on to this question about material culture. So I think in food history, tends to be an emphasis on tableware and what appears on a table. And what survives in museum collections, of course, is elite objects. If you're lucky, like in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, there's more than elite objects there, but they're quite unusual objects, the ones that survive. The everyday and the ordinary, including from aristocratic context, don't survive. For instance, it's very hard to find a kind of storage jar like the one, that pickled jar that I showed you, for an Italian context. And that survives because it's got some slightly crazy images on it, different pub signs that are kind of around the edges of it. And that's why it survived. And that's why Glacier, the collector in the early 19th century, bought it. And I've tried to differentiate between kinds of earthenware that he buys. He does use different names for things. I've tried to match them up. This is from Scappi's book from late 16th century. I've tried to match up when he talks about buying a piñata, or he talks about buying a conca as well, to see if these are kinds of things that he might be stewing things with. A lot of things with covers, for instance. He's buying. In fact, one of the first pots he buys is a pot with a cover. I'm not sure he brought anything from Rome, so there's a kind of fiction about it, thinking that he's starting a household as soon as he gets there. It might be that he brought some things from Rome, but he buys a salt cellar. One of the first things he buys a pot with a lid on it. He buys a salt cellar. So it kind of suggests to me that he is really setting up his household from scratch, because a salt cellar is a really central object in any man's household. Yeah. The problem with the piñata, which he talks about, is that the piñata might look like that image over there on the left-hand side. But as you see, what Florio says in the early 17th century, that it's any kind of earthen pipkin, posset, pot to boil meat in. So it could be a whole range. It's very generic. It's a very generic word. And it's a very generic understanding of that word. So I think, as we know from inventories, it's very hard to differentiate between even the kinds of metals used and the kinds of materials that pots are made out of, unless you're lucky, unless you see an inventory that kind of details these things. Quite often, as they say, kitchenware ends up in an inventory as kitchenware. There's not a lot of differentiation. And to be honest, it's not only kitchenware, it's also books, right? I mean, it's a whole range of things in inventories. We want the inventories to be much more detailed than they are, and they're not. But rather fortunately, Thomas Jones' account is extraordinarily detailed. And that's kind of what I'm playing with, is that level of detail. And I'm kind of wondering, why. That's an autobiographical question. That's really a question about his biography. Why is he so attentive to this kind of detail? Because it is really unusual. Okay, so he goes back to England. He fails to make any money. William Hamilton turns out to be a kind of lousy patron. He's moved around a couple of studios. He's in a different part of Naples now, and he decides to take Maria and his two daughters back to England. And I've used that image because it's an image of a monastery that you would see as you're leaving in a ship. So he's taking a ship back to England in August of 1783, and that's one of the last pages in which he uses Italian. So there's a kind of weird sense of acculturation, right? As he kind of stays in Naples, uses this Neapolitan when he's describing things. And then as he's sailing off, he starts using English again. He buys, before he goes on his ship, he buys 6 live chickens that he takes with him. He describes killing every one of them in his account, in his memoirs, actually. It's quite interesting. Stews them all. He talks about making chicken stew. He buys 24 pounds of macaroni and 5 pounds of Parmesan with him. It's quite interesting that he's really taking the food that, has become, this part of his kind of, if you want, food life. It also details things like gifts to servants and bribes, and he brings provisions for the ship. He also has a kind of last meal in Naples before he gets on the boat. I'm going to leave the account books there now, and he then goes on, and as soon as he gets back at the bottom of the Thames, he's eating roast beef, and and it's all back to England. It's quite extraordinary, really, that it's completely gone. And we know that British people in this period, I mean, you talk about the macaroni and the recipe books, we know that Parmesan is a delicacy, and people are eating Parmesan, and there are grocers in England selling Parmesan. But it's as if that food life has disappeared. There's no evidence of it in the rest of the accounts. He has a few accounts that get him to London. He eventually goes back to Wales, but there's no sense of that, of his Neapolitan life, which was extraordinarily Neapolitan. That's what's so, I think, striking about the accounts, is that the extent to which he really is eating like a Neapolitan. So some conclusions. One is this question about acculturation, and I call elementary acculturation. Jones is in some ways not quite a typical grand tourist because he spends 3 years there. He's a resident in Naples. But he is in constant contact with the grand tour community. And there has been, Jeremy Black has a chapter on food in the grand tour, and most of it's made up of people kind of, sort of stereotypes about the French eating sauces and the Italians doing this. And so it's not actually very, very helpful, that history of food in the grand tour. But what is quite extraordinary about Jones is, on the one hand, he kind of performs that. I mean, that's what he's saying in that passage when he's in Rome. But what I really want is some roast beef. But actually, in practice, he's eating, as I say, completely like a Neapolitan. So, in terms of food history, because I've worked already on street food, or the buying of food on the street, I am aware of the extent to which food history is partly being distorted by the sources that we have, so that we have recipe books, we've got tableware. So the emphasis is on sitting down, eating with a plate in front of us. But we know there's other kinds of ways of eating, and there's other places in which food is being eaten. I think I mentioned the point about guild records that might privilege certain kinds of food. I know that, for instance, some work that I've done in Rome in the 17th century, it's pretty clear that people are not eating just meat and fish and the things that you'd find that are regulated by guilds, but a lot of wild food is also being eaten. So we know that blackberries are getting into Rome in the 17th century. We know that people are catching frogs and snails, and they're selling them as well. And they're not regulated by the guilds in the same way that other kinds of products are. So that's another thing to think about as well, that if we are telling a history of provisioning of the city, should we only look at these fiscal records? Because it's almost certain that people are also bringing in food illegally, informally. Yeah. And they're there. You can see the foods and the rest of it. You see the frogs and the blackberries and the snails. One thing that I continue to kind of grapple with is this question about the ephemerality of food, but also the problem of trying to capture the everyday. And I think that Jones's accounts give me this opportunity to capture the everyday in quite an extraordinary way around the consumption of this one family. And then the last point, I think, which is the one that I am hopefully have brought out today, is linking production with consumption. So I think some of the food that Jones is buying is, as I've said to you, kind of ready to cook. He buys, for instance, some cheese from a neighbor. So I think there's quite a lot of things that are being produced in the city as well, in the back houses or the back ends of cities. That food is coming in through these networks, these foodways coming in from hinterlands, but also the food is also being produced in the city or on the edges of the city, or animals or things are being gathered or herbs are being collected on the edges of the city. So I think that we have to think about this story about foodways into the city as a kind of as quite a varied one. It's not simply what we can see through fiscal records. And so I'm hoping that through the accounts book, but also looking at images, I'm always ready to look at these images. And Naples is particularly rich. Late 18th century Naples is one of the things that I said at the very beginning, one of the things that tourists want to see, and what British travelers want to see is people on the street and food on the street. And those are the kinds of images they take back with them. So compared to Milan or Florence in this period, Naples is particularly rich in this kind of representational culture. So what I'm trying to do is match that representational culture with these archival sources in Naples, but also with Thomas Jones accounts. I think I'll end there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.